Overwhelming support at the UN General Assembly for Palestine's bid for full membership. It echoes the rising condemnation of Israel's war on Gaza. But the US says it will veto the motion again at the Security Council. So what difference could the resolution make? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Neave. The international community has debated Palestinian statehood for decades. Full membership at the United Nations would effectively recognise that. Sweeping support at the General Assembly is the first step, but the final seal of approval comes from the UN Security Council. Last month, the United States vetoed a resolution tabled by Algeria and says it will do so again. So can the moral weight of world opinion reflected at the UN General Assembly pressure the US to reconsider? What difference could the backing of 143 nations make to Palestine's non-member special observer status? We'll explore these and other issues with our guests in a moment, but first this report by Katia Lopez-Horian.
Condemnation of Israel's war on Gaza has led to protests like these, from Sana'a in Yemen to Jordan's capital, Amman. Rallies in solidarity with Palestinians that first took hold in U.S. universities have spread around the world. And at the United Nations, the General Assembly voted overwhelmingly to grant new rights and privileges to Palestine. It's also calling on the Security Council to reconsider Palestine's bid to become a full UN member.
We want peace. We want freedom. A yes vote is a vote for Palestinian existence. It is not against any state.
Israel says the move is absurd, especially after Hamas's attack on October the 7th. While using a prop, the Israeli ambassador said the resolution disregards UN statutes.
You are shredding the UN Charter with your own hands. Yes, that's what you're doing, shredding the UN Charter. Shame on you.
The UN vote may be widely symbolic, but it comes as countries such as Spain, Ireland, and other EU members plan to formally recognize the state of Palestine on May 21st.
The international community are overwhelmingly saying that they want that long-term resolution to the conflict, and that involves two states.
Despite new rights and privileges, Palestine remains a non-member observer state at the UN without the right to vote. And the U.S. has made it clear it will use its veto power to block Palestinian membership and statehood until important issues are resolved with Israel. Katia Lopez-Horian, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Right, well, let's bring in our guests now. From Rome, we're joined by Jeffrey Sachs. He's a former special advisor to the UN Secretary General, now the director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University. In Ramallah, Mustafa Barghouti is the General Secretary of the Palestinian National Initiative. And in London is Yossi Mekelberg, an Associate Fellow at the Middle East and North Africa Programme at the UK think tank Chatham House. A very warm welcome to all three of you. Welcome to Inside Story. Yossi, I wonder if I can start with you, if you could help us set the scene, because until now, Palestine has only held the status of an observer at the UN. What does the overwhelming passing of this new resolution, what does that mean in terms of the rights and privileges afforded to Palestine now?
In principle, it hasn't changed much, because it's the Security Council that such a resolution will actually bestow recognition as a state. But I think symbolically, it is a very important step forward, in which you have more than 140 states actually very clearly declared that they want to see Palestine recognized as a state. And at the same time, it's known to everyone that the only country that blocks Palestinian statehood, from being internationally recognized, is the United States, while the United States is moving slowly in different direction when it comes to its relations with the United States. I think moving towards that, and probably if this is the direction, we might see the United States also at one point or another, hopefully soon, follow what the General Assembly just said yesterday and recognize Palestinian statehood.
Jeffrey, following on from that, amongst some of the rights and privileges now afforded the Palestinians is the right to be seated among member states alphabetically, an ability also to submit proposals and amendments directly without having to do it through another country. As Yossi says, though, these only seem to be a slight move forward when it comes to what the Palestinian state is really looking forward to. Is this largely symbolic, then?
Well, it's important. It's more than symbolic. It demonstrates where world opinion is overwhelmingly. And it is correct. The United States is the sole obstacle, actually, not only to Palestine's membership in the United Nations as the 194th member, but actually the United States is the sole obstacle, in my view, to peace in the region. Because with the membership, with sovereignty, with the implementation of a globally recognized state on the 1967 borders with capital in East Jerusalem and control over the Islamic holy sites, there would also be the ability to have peace with the countries of the region, as in the Arab Peace Initiative and in the Arab and Islamic leadership statement in Riyadh last November. So the United States is not only blocking a Palestinian state, it's blocking peace. It's blocking peace on behalf of a radical, extremist, violent Israeli government, which is committing massive war crimes, and quite likely the ICJ will rule genocide. This is what the United States is enabling right now. It's absolutely distressing for me as an American to see this.
Right.
Young people on my campus were aghast at what this administration is doing.
I sense early on in this conversation an eagerness by the two of you who have spoken so far to focus on the obstacles that are clearly in the way when it comes to Palestine's full membership. But before we go into the obstacles, Mustafa, turning to you, if this decision at the UN means anything, it's where you are. Your reaction to what played out at the UN?
Well, it means a lot. Besides the symbolic aspect of it, it sends a message, a very powerful political message, that the world is for the rights of Palestinians to be free from occupation, from the system of apartheid, from this terrible genocide that is happening. And while we are talking, by the way, the Israelis are committing terrible massacres at this very moment in Rafah and inside Gaza City, in Al Zaytun neighborhood and in Jabalia, trying to ethnically cleanse one more time Jabalia area. So, of course, the whole world is sending a very powerful message here that they don't accept what's happening to Palestinians. But more than that, I think this vote that took place exposed how isolated the United States and Israel are. You have to remember that the United States of America, this huge power, and Israel could not mobilize more than 3 countries to vote with them, considering that the others are Palau, Micronesia, Marshall Islands, and Israel and United States itself. I mean, with all due respect, these little islands don't really, I mean, we all know that they vote according to what Americans tell them. So in reality, this is a huge isolation of the American position.
Right.
One moment, please. And also it shows how isolated the fact that the United States have obstructed the membership in the United Nations Security Council. It is totally unacceptable, and the world is saying that.
Right, absolutely. We will delve, no doubt, into US obstruction, as you say. I wonder, though, practically speaking, Mustafa, given what has played out at the UN, whether practically this makes any difference to the suffering of Palestinians in Gaza and Palestinians in the occupied West Bank.
Not a lot, and not enough for sure. It's very little if you compare it to what needs to be done. Netanyahu's behavior in undermining what was a possible agreement for a ceasefire, when Hamas accepted what was proposed to them by the United States, Egypt, and Qatar after they were told that Israel accepts it. And once Hamas accepted it, Israel undermined it. And Netanyahu initiated his Rafah operation, which will not be limited to the eastern side of Rafah. Not at all. He already expanded it into other areas, and I'm sure he will not stop till he finishes the total destruction of Rafah, which means destruction of all of Gaza Strip. The only thing that will stop Netanyahu is sanctions immediately. There has to be military sanctions. There has to be economic sanctions. There has to be real actions by all these governments that kept telling us for the last 2 months that they are against an operation in Rafah, and they're doing nothing when he is committing this terrible massacre. I'm talking about Europeans, I'm talking about the United States of America, I'm talking about even the Arab countries. This has to be stopped, and it can be stopped only with immediate sanctions on Israel.
Right. Let me bring in Yossi, because clearly, as we've heard there from Mustafa, practically on its own, this enhanced state at the UN, this enhanced status for Palestine at the UN won't on its own make much of a difference at all without a multi-pronged approach. Sanctions is something, of course, that Mustafa reiterated there. But does this, though, at least pave the way for full membership at some time in the not-too-distant future, Yossi?
I think, first of all, when I say symbolism in diplomacy is important. And I think it sends a clear message what the world thinks. I think, again, we are edging closer to recognition. For all means and practices, a Palestinian state exists in one shape or form. It's about the recognition itself. There is leadership. All in all, we know the territory of what is a future Palestinian state. So this is there. It's about how it recognizes and how it changes the relations around the negotiation table when it eventually comes between the Israelis and Palestinians. Now, but at the same time, the most important thing right now is to stop the war, because this is not going to change what the people of Rafah and the people of Gaza are enduring right now. This doesn't stop settler violence. Doesn't bring us much closer into ending this conflict. That's where the concentration should be. So the recognition, Palestine of a state, is important as part of a much bigger move towards a peace process and a peace deal.
I know by listening to you that you're all very, very keen to talk about the obstacles in the way of Palestine becoming a full member of the UN. Turning to you, Jeffrey, the main stumbling block, as we've said, remains at the UN Security Council, where, just to remind our viewers, at least 9 affirmative votes and no veto from any of the 5 permanent members is required. The problem, as we've all said, is that at the moment a key member, the United States, repeatedly votes against recognising the Palestinians as an independent state, claiming it would be, quote, harmful for peace. Jeffrey, can you explain what they mean by harmful for peace, the rationale behind this?
U.S. politics is dominated by the Israel lobby. It's very simple. The Washington political class has sided with Israel no matter what Israel has done, up to and including genocide. It's not complicated, but the American public is against this. The young people are shocked, dismayed, and out on the campuses across the country. And then Congress and the administrators of these universities bring in the police to bash their heads and to call in the police. So this is extremely unpopular in the United States, but this is a political class that is really led by the Israel lobby. I think what is important is the whole world make clear to the United States, you alone are blocking peace now. This is what the Palestinian ambassador said yesterday at the UN in a very powerful speech. Ambassador Riyad Mansour in a very eloquent and powerful speech. The Israeli ambassador Erhard gave the single worst and most disgraceful speech that I recall in listening to hundreds of speeches in the UN General Assembly during the past 25 years of my work with the UN. Absolutely a speech of hate and a speech of war. But he was counting on a political class in Washington that will stand by Israel. It won't stand by Israel for long under this, because the American public opinion is absolutely against this, and for absolutely good reason.
Let's turn to Mustafa again, because the US has also claimed that the recognition of Palestinian statehood would, quote, undermine efforts to resume negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians, essentially rewarding the Palestinians for whipping up international pressure on Israel and effectively rewarding the armed wing of Hamas, Islamic Jihad and other armed groups for carrying out violence. What do you make of this argument by the United States, Mustafa?
It's the mother of all hypocrisies. It's such an amount of hypocrisy when the United States and some European countries keep talking about a two-state solution and advocate for two-state solution, and at the same time do not even recognize Palestine. And not only that, they do not say that Israel must end its occupation of Palestinian territories. If Israel does not end its occupation, how can we have a state? Where will we have it? In the diaspora? And third, they are not saying that Israel must dismantle all settlements that exist now in the West Bank and Jerusalem. Without that, we will not have a Palestinian state. So what you see here is a huge amount of hypocrisy by these countries, that all they do by talking about two-state solution, all they mean is to give Israel more time to continue the process of settlement building and annexation of the West Bank and killing the very possibility of a Palestinian state. Look at what's happening. There are talks, there is this resolution in the United Nations, which is just paper. But in reality, on the ground, what is Netanyahu doing? He's closing off, destroying any final contact between any Palestinian land and any other Arab country by taking over Rafah and Rafah crossing with Egypt. This is one of the destructive acts that is aiming at killing the possibility of a two-state solution. So this American position and some European positions are nothing but hypocrisy. They are hypocritical when they speak only about a two-state without recognizing the Palestinian state. And one more thing, I think when the whole world saw how the Israeli delegates arrogantly shredded the Charter of the United Nations in front of everybody of the General Assembly, what does that mean? He's sending a message that Israel is above the law and above international law and impunitive to international law, and that could not have happened except without the American full support to Israel.
Yossi, turning to you, Mustafa is very, very adamant. Turning to Yossi, Mustafa is very, very adamant there. There's a huge amount of hypocrisy. There's absolutely no incentive whatsoever for Israel to ever recognise a Palestinian state while it goes about accelerating its settlement building in the occupied West Bank. Of course, both Jeffrey and Mustafa have referred to that semi-theatrical moment at the UN in which Gilad Erdan, the Israeli ambassador to the UN, shredded the UN Charter, accusing the UN of appeasing so-called terrorist-laden Palestinian politicians or the authority who want to kill all Israelis and Jews. Is the passing, Yossi, is the passing of this resolution in any way a violation of the UN Charter, as Israel argues?
Obviously it's not, and unfortunately, Ambassador Erdan is dealing more and is an inclination more to the theater and the drama of the UN instead of substance. It is actually the role of the United Nations to decide about recognition of other states. So, no, and all this kind of theater of shredding the charter, I don't think he covers himself with glory and not the country he represents. This is highly regrettable. Right. I also don't take the oversimplistic view that if only change the Israeli government, we remove all the obstacles for peace. There are other elements outside Israel that are obstacles for peace, but Israel needs a change of government. Israel needs a change of direction, and without it, yes, I agree, there is also in the United States an element of hypocrisy. If the United States believes in a two-state solution, let's move on from recognition of statehood as a condition part of the negotiation, but put this first and then put both Israel and Palestine on equal footing that they can negotiate with one another as states and deal with all the other outstanding issues from Jerusalem as the capital of both and refugees and borders and then settlements and the rest as two states dealing with each other with responsibility and with respect. And that's we haven't seen, and that's what must change.
So if there are going to be future negotiations, they must be on a level playing field with respect and responsibility on both sides of the equation. Jeffrey, turning to you again, because I also want to look at one of the other apparent obstacles for Palestine being a full member of the UN. It comes from concerns about setting a precedent for other observer countries that are aspiring to full membership at the UN. I'm thinking of Kosovo and its tensions with Serbia, Taiwan and its tensions with China. Will offering full membership to Palestine complicate similar parallel situations elsewhere in the world? Kosovo, Taiwan?
No. This has been the will of the international community and core to international law for at least 57 years since the 1967 war. The notion that there need to be two states, of course, goes back even 2 decades before that. This is a long and specific history. There needs to be political self-determination for Palestine and a state of Palestine as a UN member state. This is not in any way a dangerous precedent. This is quite the contrary. This is a protection of basic political rights that have been recognized for decades. Why the U.S. position is not only deeply hypocritical, it's profoundly cynical, because what it says is, well, let the parties decide that, knowing that Israel says no. So it has given a veto to the state of having a state of Palestine to Israel, to the occupier. This is an absurdity, but this is the U.S. position. We don't want to decide on a state of Palestine because Israel needs to negotiate that. Are you kidding? The occupying power? The government that says Greater Israel, we control everything, that's the one that has the veto over Palestinian self-determination. That's the actual U.S. position. I don't know how much is cynical, how much is bought off, and how much they're fools, but they have been blocking peace for decades. That's the U.S., I mean.
All three of you have been very vehement in unravelling the obstacles in the way when it comes to Palestine's full membership of the UN. I wonder if we can look ahead to what full membership would mean if and when it happens. Mustafa, Israel was granted full membership of the UN 75 years ago. Today, Palestine is still, as we all know, very much waiting. What would it mean to be negotiating with Israel, as we've mentioned before, on this level playing field, state to state?
Well, let me remind you that when Israel was recognized by the UN, there were 2 conditions that Israel had to fulfill, and they never fulfilled it, which is the fact that 181 resolution said that there will be a Palestinian state near Israel. And that never happened. And second, that Israel would implement the 194 resolution, which would allow all Palestinian refugees that were displaced by Israel to come back home. Also, they did not implement that. So practically, Israel undermined its membership by not fulfilling these conditions. That's one. Second, yes, there is a value of recognition of Palestine and accepting it as a full member, because that would mean that every measure of Israeli settlement and every measure of annexation has no political and legal value anymore. It would mean this is a state under occupation. That would be absolutely useful. But I have to say that even when the Palestinians and some Arab countries proposed to the United States a plan for 3-year path towards a state through negotiations with Israel, etc., United States refused to accept the plan. Blinken refused to accept it and said you have to negotiate everything with Israel. While Israel took a resolution in their parliament with 99 members out of 110 Jewish members
Mustafa,
refusing a Palestinian state.
Mustafa, I'm keenly aware that we're approaching the end of the programme, and I want to focus now on what a Palestinian state would look like. So as a follow-up to you, Mustafa, and of course what it would look like maybe in an entirely separate show, but given the huge disillusionment with the status quo there, particularly in the occupied West Bank, the failure to hold elections, in close to almost 2 decades now, how ready is Palestine for statehood?
Oh, Palestine has been ready for a long time. Look, we've built many states in the Gulf. We've built many states in other countries. We are so equipped academically, we are equipped scientifically, with resources, with people who are so capable. It's the occupation that is preventing us. And more than that, Israel is transforming into a fascist structure. This government is fascist by all means. And that's the obstacle. It's not the lack of readiness on the side of the Palestinians or the need for reform as they claim. The problem is occupation, the system of apartheid, the fascism that is growing, and that will not be stopped without sanctions, without boycott, without effective policy that says to Israel, enough is enough, and for the sake of Palestinians and Israelis, peace has to come, and it cannot come without the freedom of the Palestinian people.
As you say, peace cannot come without the freedom of the Palestinian people. It has been a fascinating discussion, a very, very interesting journey with all three of you. Jeffrey Sachs, Mustafa Barghouti, Yossi Mekelberg, thank you very much for joining us on Inside Story. And thank you too for watching. And you can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Neave Barker, and the whole team here, it's bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.